If you want a glimpse into who the KhoiKhoi are, then stick around because I will give you that glimpse and spark your curiosity enough to go and find out more about them and their history. But before we get too far into the specifics, I think it makes sense to clarify who the Khoisan are. It seems like it's a term that encompasses more than one group. The Khoisan is kind of a combined term. It refers to both the KhoiKhoi and the San people, who are sometimes referred to as Bushmen. We covered these people in the previous episode, and while they share some similarities in language and culture, they actually have distinct ways of life. For this episode, we're just going to zero in on the KhoiKhoi. Focusing specifically on the KhoiKhoi will help us understand and kind of tease out the nuances of the pastoralist traditions and their unique journey through Southern Africa history, in context, of course, of pre-colonial South Africa. To get us started, what are some of the key differences between the KhoiKhoi and the San? Well, I think the most significant difference is in their subsistence strategies. The KhoiKhoi are pastoralists, meaning that they herd cattle and sheep, whereas the San are hunter-gatherers. Their relationship with the land and how they survived was just fundamentally different. The difference really kind of shaped their social structures, their movements, and even their interactions with other groups. According to the South African History Online website, the KhoiKhoi arrived in Southern Africa around the beginning of the Christianity era. And that's a pretty late arrival compared to the San, who have been there for thousands of years. Which begs the question, where did the Khoi come from? This is the kind of question that intrigued historians and anthropologists for a long time. And while their exact origins are still debated, the general consensus is that they migrated southward from East Africa, bringing with them herding practices and cultural traditions. They brought a whole new way of life to Southern Africa. Their arrival and subsequent interactions with the existing groups like the San and later Bantu-speaking farmers kinds of adds another layer to this complex tapestry of Southern African cultures. It is most likely that the KhoiKhoi acquired cattle through their interactions with Bantu-speaking farmers who were also migrating southward around the same time. These farmers originated in West Africa and they had already developed agricultural practices and livestock herding. This would imply that the arrival of the KhoiKhoi and their cattle kind of coincides with the southward migration of some of the Bantu-speaking farmers who brought agricultural practices to Southern Africa. It was a period of significant cultural exchange which created a more diverse and interconnected landscape. The region was already undergoing a pretty major transformation, and their arrival just kind of added another dynamic to the mix, which led to both cooperation and competition for resources. The initial encounters with the San involved clashes and peaceful ways to coexist. Their different ways of life meant that they used the land in different ways. The KhoiKhoi needed grazing land for their cattle, and the San relied on hunting and gathering. So you can see how that could lead to some tension. Tensions which escalated into conflicts, especially over access to water and grazing land. There is also evidence of trade and cultural exchange between the two groups. So despite their differences, they did find ways to interact and even benefit from each other's existence. The KhoiKhoi might have traded livestock or dairy products with the San in exchange for hunted game or knowledge of the local environment. It just challenges that sort of simplistic narrative that a clash of civilizations we often hear about, and it sounds like it was much more nuanced. The KhoiKhoi entered Southern Africa. They brought their pastoralist traditions. They had to navigate this complex landscape of existing cultures, sometimes clashing, sometimes collaborating. Their history is really marked by this remarkable ability to adapt to changing circumstances, whether it's environmental shifts or meeting with new groups, or later even the pressures of colonialism. Khoi's reliance on cattle really had a profound impact on their social organization and worldview. Cattle weren't just a source of food and livelihood for the KhoiKhoi. They represented wealth, status, and even spiritual significance. They were used in rituals, marriage negotiations, and even conflict resolution. It wasn't just economics, it was their entire social and spiritual fabric. Their movements were dictated by the needs of their herds, and their social spending was often measured by the number of cattle they possessed. So families with larger herds naturally had more influence and power. Pretty much the same as in the modern world, where people who have money have more influence and power. Their social structure wasn't as rigid as what we might see in like kingdoms and empires, but cattle ownership did create a hierarchy. It's a fascinating example of how economic factors can shape social dynamics, even in societies that thrive for equality. So we've kind of laid the groundwork. We know that the Khoi were pastoralists. They migrated south. They acquired cattle, likely from Bantu-speaking farmers, and established a sort of semi-nomadic lifestyle based on hierarchy. They encountered the San, sometimes clashing, sometimes cooperating. We can now focus on their unique relationship with the land and their cattle. They knew where to find the best grazing lands, how to predict weather patterns, and how to locate water sources, even in the driest seasons. It sounds like they had a deep, deep understanding of the land. It's like a kind of ecological knowledge that's been honed for many decades. Their survival really depended on their ability to anticipate weather challenges and respond to them. And sometimes it was an unpredictable environment. It makes me think of modern day ecologists and meteorologists, but without all the fancy technology. And the Khoikhoi had to rely on just their keen sense of observations and generations of accumulated wisdom. This, of course, is likely in addition to whatever knowledge exchanged happened when they arrived at southern Africa, wherein the San would possibly help them in this regard. I've wondered if they had the concept of land ownership or territorial boundaries as it exists today. But listen, the concept of land ownership was and is much more fluid, and it was tied to the seasonal movements and the availability of grazing resources. They didn't really have fixed boundaries in the way we think of them today. It was more about like having access to the resources they needed rather than claiming ownership of a particular piece of land. They understood that land was a shared resource. They had very well developed herding strategies. Some of you will find this amazing, but they had trained herding dogs, carefully selected grazing areas, and they even employed controlled burning to promote new grass growth. While they were possibly cautious of starting wildfires, they understood the benefits of controlled burning, how it could clear out the old vegetation and encourage growth of fresh, nutritious grass for their cattle. They were actually managing the ecosystem or environment in a way. It's pretty forward thinking for a society that didn't have modern technology. Their practices were really rooted in this deep understanding of the ecological processes. It's a reminder that indigenous knowledge often holds valuable insights that can inform modern conservation and land management practices. Now, AfricanBudgetSafaris.com mentions that cattle were also unfortunately a source of conflict between the Khoi and other groups, especially during times of drought and resource scarcity. As I mentioned earlier, the cattle represented wealth and status for the Khoi, and this made them a target for raiding by other groups, especially the Bantu-speaking communities, or even other Khoi clans, or the San, who are hunter-gatherers. They eat meat. You can imagine growing a chicken only for your neighbor to come steal it. Cattle raids were pretty common occurrence and they could lead to violent conflicts and retaliatory attacks as well. I know we're focusing on the Khoi, but I can't help but wonder how the arrival of cattle and the rise of pastoralism impacted the San, who had been living there as hunter-gatherers for so long. The introduction of cattle did have an impact on the San communities. Some groups adopted elements of pastoralism. They acquired livestock and incorporated herding into their subsistence strategies. There was some degree of cultural exchange and adaptability happening between the two groups. It wasn't a one-way street. The San, with their deep knowledge of the local environment, had skills and insights that were valuable to the KhoiKhoi as well. It was this kind of complex interplay of cultural influences with both groups adopting and adjusting to each other's presence. This brings me back to this idea of adaptation. The KhoiKhoi, with their mobile lifestyle and their dependence on livestock, they were particularly vulnerable to environmental changes and external pressures. They developed a remarkable resilience and capacity for innovation. They were skilled negotiators able to forge alliances with other groups, and they were really adept at adapting their herding practices to changing conditions. So, what role did cattle play in their beliefs and rituals? Cattle were central to many of their rituals and ceremonies. They were often sacrificed to appease the spirits or to ensure successful harvest. Their skins were used in clothing and rituals, and their milk and blood were sometimes used in ceremonial drinks. Their relationship with cattle went far beyond just purely practical. It was a relationship that was infused with symbolism, respect, and reverence. They believed in a supreme being, Tsui Gwab. I hope I'm not butchering this, who was the creator of all things. They also had this rich pantheon of lesser deities and spirits, some of whom were associated with cattle, fertility, and rain. So they have a pretty complex spiritual world with different deities and spirits governing different aspects of their life. This is probably a reminder that our modern Western worldview is just one way of seeing the world. It's a perspective that we could learn a lot from as we grapple with environmental and social challenges in the 21st century. A good question. Is there any of the Khoikhoi's traditional knowledge of herding and medicinal plants and just the natural world in general being preserved? I would guess that there are movements to recognize and value indigenous knowledge systems, document their traditional ecological knowledge, their understanding of medicinal plants, and their sustainable herding practices. And that's so important in my view. These knowledge systems were developed over centuries and observation and interaction with the environment. That could really inform modern practices to conservation and sustainable living. There's a growing recognition that indigenous knowledge is a valuable resource that could help us address some of the most pressing challenges facing humanity today. We need to appreciate for the importance of preserving and celebrating cultural heritage. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why we do have some of the holidays, which were mostly informed by the colonial era, which we will cover in this channel. I hope this episode has sparked your curiosity about the KhoiKhoi people. The story of the KhoiKhoi is just a reminder that the past has never truly passed and that we all have a role to play in shaping more than just an equitable future. Until next time, subscribe.